I tend to have like a pad of paper with me, and I just kind of do scratch outline notes, both from a source and what I think I'm working on. I've been experimenting lately with note-taking on a computer, which I never thought I would do because I'm kind of comfortable and I like to write things out, but I also have really terrible handwriting, so sometimes I go back and I can't really read what I've written. But there's a program that I found that's available, free download. It's called Evernote, evernote.com. And it's a wonderful note-taking apparatus. You can categorize notes by topics, you can cross-reference notes, and what it does is it keeps a sort of scroll bar of all your notes in order, but then you can jump around and it's very searchable. It's free. It also lets you keep a database of your notes online, which means you can download your note database to any computer that has the software on it. And so what that means is you can take your laptop into the library, you can take notes. If you're taking notes off of something that is online, you can literally clip that into your note software without having to write anything out. And so one of the things that it tends to do, at least for me, is it encourages more note-taking because it's not as physically demanding as writing it out and getting tired with your fingers and your wrists and everything else. So I've not abandoned writing notes entirely, but I am finding I'm doing a lot more of it on the computer than I used to. Something that I learned to do, I think, some time ago, and it was more or less learning to abandon ideas. And what that meant was abandoning research and notes. Sometimes, I talk to students, it's like, Medea had to kill her children, and sometimes you have to do the same thing with your ideas and everything. You have to have that sense where you feel that that's just a different paper or a different project. It doesn't belong here. And I mean, everyone has to do that, but I think that took me a long time to learn. There's always a sense of trying to make everything conform to something, and becoming comfortable with doing something else or changing plans. It took me a long, long time.
That book, I began as the editor. I began actually as the second editor. It's a history that covers several centuries. I came in as an editor, and one of the things I always do as an editor is fact check as I go, so that's an important aspect. And for that, I could use the internet, especially now. I think every year the internet is better and better in terms of what's available. And I would make decisions about how reliable a website would be, or any historic site. It's important to know who sponsors it and who the authorities are who have put the material on it. Wikipedia, for example, is a good general place, but if you're relying on that for hard data, you want to make sure that you have confirmed that with other sources, because that's written by anyone who is driven to write information for that part of the internet. And then I, of course, learned the history as I went along. I was familiar with some of it because I lived in that area. But then as I got into the writing of it and the revising of it, I've had to learn more details. I didn't know any of the political history of the U.S. and Great Britain and the various treaties that set boundaries in the, from 1790 on, actually, with the Spanish and the U.S. and so forth. So I had a lot to learn. And I do that through basically library research. We have a good lending library program here in California. Used to be what they called interlibrary loan, and now some of the systems call it Link Plus, by which you can get books. Almost any book is available from one of the libraries.
For myself, I do two things. I keep a notebook, which I write with my hands, notes, ideas. It's by my bedside, and it's kind of an evolving document of the research, and sometimes related research, not just one. It's not that I have one for every project. I have one. And then I begin to collect information and put them in files or in the computer or outside the computer, and I begin to assemble the pieces of this map. And of course, sometimes you read something and you thought about it in a certain way, and then you read something else and you think, well, you know, that you could think about it another way, and then you have to go back to it. So you want to have that available to you. Sometimes read things again. So I created kind of a depository of these concepts. Part of what you do in research is you talk to people. So it could be a taxi driver, it could be your spouse, it could be your kid, it could be a respected scientist. It doesn't, and you talk to people and you try to articulate to them what you're doing, and then it's amazing how much of cues and concepts and ideas you get from other people. And also in the process of you trying to articulate that to a taxi driver, you find that, oh, I never thought about it this way. And it actually helps you progress. So bouncing ideas, talking, in my case, I give lectures or presentations about these topics, even though that fairly early on, I have something and I'm beginning to share that and get concepts and ideas, feedback on these.
It's a lot of trial and error, and you really have to be willing to go down take some wrong turns eventually. Because again, I would get books and I'd go, no, this is not exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this. And it's almost as if the search refines itself through time. It is an understanding that I'm figuring out things as I go. And so I might find some information and then get into the writing of the scene, get into the writing of the chapter, and realize, no, that wasn't exactly what I needed. What I really needed was this.
What I love about research and about being a journalist is that you are a professional amateur. You are never expected to be an expert in anything, but you can be curious about everything. What I don't like and what is inevitable is the stage in your research where you have learned, you know, you're halfway or a third into the project. You've collected this enormous pile of information, but you haven't yet started to make sense of it. You know, the thread of the story or whatever project you're working on hasn't emerged yet. And so there's this long period, and it can last for, or at least it seems long, it can last for, you know, an afternoon, or it can last for several days or even longer depending on the project, where you're just saying, I have no idea, you know, how I'm ever going to tell this story. It's too big, or it's too complicated, or it's boring, or, you know, these people aren't, you know, doing what I want them to be doing. And that can be really frustrating. And I think when I first started as a journalist, that was terrifying to me, because you think, oh, and a story is never going to come out of this mess, you know, that I've created around myself. But you find that it always does. You know, of course, some stories are better than others, but, you know, if you do the research you're supposed to be doing and you have a good story to begin with, a story comes out of it. And so I think I still don't enjoy that stage for sure, but you do learn that it has an end to it.
librarians are very helpful, and they want to be helpful. They want to be helpful if you tell them what you're looking for. Because they take pride in knowing what they have in their collections. And sometimes take pride in what they have in their collections, you know, something that's rare and kind of distinguishes their library from some other library. Yeah, librarians are a great resource. The internet just generally is an extraordinary resource.
Oh, yeah, maybe talk about that.
In fact, it used to be when I was working on a novel or nonfiction, I would be going to the public library at least once a week. One of the things I work a lot with in fiction is song lyrics. I like to include song lyrics. And I always wanted, I know the lyrics of, I don't know, thousands of songs, but I always want to get them right and make sure I know who the composer was and what year it was published. And it used to be you could only find that at the public library. You'd have to go into these big catalogs. Now, pick a song, you know. I Get a Kick Out of You, Cole Porter. All you have to do is click in, I Get a Kick Out of You. 2 seconds, the lyrics, 10 different versions of the lyrics are on the screen. I don't go to the public library downtown in Santa Cruz anymore. So much is online. It's really a great blessing for just finding small bits of information.
What I like about research, and I've been kind of a latecomer to enjoying research. I think I struggled with it for a long time, and I'm finding that the better I get at it, the more I enjoy it. What I really find to be exciting, and especially like this past summer when I got to spend the whole summer doing it, was that I could immerse myself just completely, because you're by yourself. It's just you and these records. The reading room in the library is silent. Over the summer at the California State Library, I was the only person there. Almost every single day I was the only person there. And you're just immersed in trying to reconstruct this world, this long gone world. And nobody on earth is going to understand this world the same way that you do, right? Just like, you know, in a court case, the defense team and the prosecution could look at the same group of evidence and come to different conclusions about the guilt of the suspect, you know, the person on trial. Historians look at the same body of evidence, or you know, maybe slightly different bodies of evidence, and come to radically different conclusions. And so, you know, you're a detective, you're a lawyer arguing a case. You know, you have like just the angle of being interested that it's something interesting that happened in the past. So you get to kind of play all these roles. And yeah, I mean, if my poor husband had a dime for every time I had sent him a text message or an email, like, "Oh my God, this is so exciting," you know, he could. Probably pay somebody else to write the dissertation for me at that point. But so it's that kind of thing where you're just so like deeply immersed in a world.
It's very easy to get sidetracked onto a very interesting topic when you're doing research. So that can actually be a very cool part of it. It does not really, it's just an interesting thing to delve into something and then find this other place to hop into. And it's also cool, I mean, if you're in school, if you're working, you learn about a lot of different topics. And you forget a lot of it afterwards when some time passes, but you'd be surprised how much you remember. And it's because of, in some ways, how difficult you had to look for the material. You know, if it was easy, it would just blend in with all the other things.
One of the biggest things that historians use is other people's footnotes. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, I think students already know to get secondary sources, the best way to get the secondary sources is to find the most recent article, book, or book on your topic, and they will have some kind of a footnote in the introduction. If it's an article, it'll be about the third footnote, sometimes the first one. If it's in the book, it'll be some kind of series of footnotes to the introduction of the book. Well, they'll say, well, for previous works have been, you know, by Bob and Susie and these other people, and they will list all that. Well, they will also give their sources. So I'll look at what somebody else has looked at. In fact, I just did this. I'm interested in some stuff that the FLCIO did in Honduras in the 1950s and 60s, and I have an article that someone else wrote about Chile in that period. And I'm looking to see, well, does she have any sources there that I don't know about? And that's not stealing. You're just, you wouldn't take it directly from her, and I'm writing on a different topic. But I'd say, what kinds of things was she able to look at? And that's a classic way, is to just the previous people that have worked on, the closest you can get, what kinds of sources did they look at? And that will usually trigger some things. Talking to librarians is always great. You know, I'm a big fan of librarians. You know, they are your friend, and they love interesting questions. They're really bored with images of X in Time magazine. They love hard research questions, and they live for this. And also, if you, of course, I always tell my students, if you talk to a reference librarian and you don't get along with them, or you went off and cried because you couldn't figure out what they wanted you to do, just come back an hour later and there'll be a different one at the counter, and you can ask them the same question all over again, and you can do it all day. And then of course you want to find one that you know, and then you can find out when they're at the desk and ask them. So you want to have your personal friend, the reference librarian. And it's also, one thing I see students do is I'll say, go look at this and this and this, I'll say, and reference librarians do it too. And the students I'll say that in my office hours, and then 2 weeks later, it turns out they did the first thing and they hit some kind of a wall. Like they couldn't figure out how to get into the website for this, or they couldn't figure out, like, did they have to call that person to find out? And they hit that wall and they get paralyzed. So one thing you have to sort of be intrepid, and it's fun, but you do have to keep hitting against those walls. And you have to not be afraid to call people. I mean, we haven't talked about this, but I do a lot of interviews, and you have to not be afraid to call strangers. You know, they're nice. They like it when you want to interview them, because it makes them feel important, and like what they do in the world is useful. And they're usually kind, nice people. And some of us have language issues. You know, some of us are English as a second language, and you think, oh, your English isn't good enough. And this is a big issue for me because I do interviews in Spanish in Central America. And I always think, oh, the most terrifying thing in the world is calling a stranger up in Spanish. But people are always nice, and you can always ask them to repeat what they said, and also they don't mind that you're nervous and have never done an interview before, because the minute they start talking, people just love to talk about themselves and what they did and be experts. So don't be afraid of that kind of research either. 2 tips I would say. I always say, look at the footnotes to recently publish something, and the other thing is talk to somebody who knows a lot about the subject. And you can that's the most efficient way. You know, just call your friend's father worked in that industry, or you know, your old neighbor, or somebody you know, any kind of connection that anybody will suggest. Talk to them, and they'll know more, and they will give you all kinds of tips on how to find out about that thing.
Help comes. People come. They let you know resources that you didn't even know were there. Information can come any way. Last month, December, I did a program out in Rancho Mirage, near Palm Springs, for a library. Afterwards, this woman, the jazz singer, we went to the soul food restaurant in Palm Desert. And so we're sitting there, and our waiter was this black Brit. And I asked him where he was from, and somewhere in the course of the conversation, he gave me insight into racism in England and a perspective that I hadn't thought of, because I didn't live there. I hadn't experienced it. So it gave me something that I could use whenever I tell this story again. So information can come from everywhere and anywhere. Woo!
Probably every writer has their own experience with this sort of thing and their own personality that they bring to it. And I hope my interview encourages young students not to be afraid of research and not to think it's just a dreary, boring chore, because believe me, nothing can be more exciting than the discoveries you can discover in those old books and those old manuscripts and people's letters and people's recollections. It's a fascinating hunt, so don't be afraid of research.